A heavy red velvet box landed on my porch on Christmas night. My sister had been a ghost for 5 years, vanishing when our family business was drowning. Now that the company was finally worth millions, she sent a gift. I felt a foolish surge of hope as I reached for the ribbon, completely unaware that one careless signature hidden inside was designed to freeze my payroll, fracture my marriage, and steal everything I had rebuilt. My name is Helena Everett, and I am 39 years old. On the evening of the 25th of December, I was standing in the kitchen of our restored Pittsburgh townhouse, basting a rosemary-crusted rib roast, feeling a profound sense of peace. The snow was falling in thick, quiet sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our dining room. My husband, Noah Mercer, was pouring a glass of dry red wine, the fire crackling in the living room grate. It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas. We had earned a quiet Christmas after everything we had survived over the past 5 years. The doorbell chimed. It was a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the soft jazz playing through the kitchen speakers. Noah frowned, setting the wine bottle down on the marble counter. "Are we expecting anyone?" he asked, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. "No one," I replied, sliding the heavy cast-iron pan back into the oven. "Maybe it is a neighbor whose package got delivered to the wrong stoop." Noah walked down the hallway to the front door. I heard the heavy deadbolt slide open, a brief murmur of voices, and the door shutting. When Noah returned to the kitchen, the relaxed slope of his shoulders had vanished. In his hands, he carried a square package. It was wrapped in thick, unblemished brown paper, but it was not the paper that drew my eye. It was the weight of it in Noah's hands, the sheer density of whatever sat inside. He placed it carefully on the center island. "Private courier," he said, his voice completely flat. "Required a physical signature." He would not leave it on the porch. "On Christmas night?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. I stepped closer. Noah reached into a drawer and pulled out a silver letter opener. He sliced through the brown paper with clinical precision, folding it back to reveal an unusually elegant red velvet box. It looked like a prop from a high-end jewelry commercial, soft and luxurious, tied with a wide, stiff satin ribbon. Sitting dead center on the top of the box was a heavy cream-colored envelope. I leaned in to read the return label printed on the top corner of the envelope. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Vanessa Holloway. The name stopped me cold. My sister. The sister who had vanished exactly 5 years ago without a phone call, without a tearful apology, without so much as a cheap condolence card after our parents died. When the family logistics business was bleeding out on the operating table, when the banks were calling at all hours of the night, when I was drowning in our father's debt and our mother's hospital bills, Vanessa had simply packed her bags, married her wealthy fiancé, and disappeared into a life of Miami sun and luxury. Yet, staring at the label, my first instinct was not suspicion. It was not anger, either, God help me. It was relief. For one reckless, stupid second, a wave of warmth flooded my chest. I believed the silence had finally broken. I convinced myself that the heavy velvet box sitting on my kitchen island was a manifestation of 5 years of accumulated guilt. The prodigal sister, finally reaching out across the chasm she had created. "It is from Vanessa," I breathed, the words tasting strange on my tongue after years of refusing to speak her name. Noah stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the red velvet. "I can read that." I ignored the tension radiating from him. My attention was entirely consumed by the handwriting on the envelope. My full name, Helena Everett, was written in a beautiful, looping cursive. It was a deliberate, haunting mimicry of the way our mother used to write our names on holiday gifts when we were children. The grand, sweeping loops of the letters were unmistakable. Vanessa had perfectly replicated it. It felt so deeply intimate, so carefully staged to bypass my defenses and strike directly at the soft, unprotected core of my grief. It felt like an olive branch wrapped in velvet. "She remembered," I said softly, my voice wavering. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the edge of the satin ribbon. After all this time, she actually reached out. Helena. Stop! Noah's hand clamped down over my wrist before I could untie the bow. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute. I looked up at him, startled. His jaw was clenched, and the warm, festive light of the kitchen suddenly felt harsh and clinical. "Do not touch it," he said quietly. "Noah, it is just a gift. It is from my sister." "Look at it, Helena," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the authoritative tone he used when managing crisis protocols at the warehouse. He pointed to the side of the box, right where the velvet lid met the base. "Look at the seal." I leaned closer, squinting under the pendant lights. He was right. A clear circular sticker meant to keep the box completely flush had been sliced cleanly down the middle, then painstakingly realigned and pressed back together. It was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. "And the delivery method," Noah continued, his eyes scanning the discarded brown wrapping paper. "Regular holiday shipping does not run tonight. Priority overnight mail does not run tonight. This was routed through an independent, private courier service. Someone paid a massive premium to ensure this specific box was placed directly into our hands on this exact day, at this exact hour." The warmth of the kitchen collapsed entirely. The smell of the roasting meat suddenly turned my stomach. I pulled my hand back from the ribbon as if it were a coiled snake. "Do not touch anything else until we know what we are looking at," Noah said. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Nothing about this feels like a sudden burst of sisterly affection." I took a step back, wrapping my arms around my waist. The humiliation hit me with the force of a physical blow. A hot, prickling flush crawled up my neck. I felt intensely, profoundly stupid. How had hope made me so careless so quickly? Vanessa had always been a master of emotional anatomy. She knew exactly where the nerves were exposed. She knew that mimicking our mother's handwriting would instantly disarm me. She knew that a Christmas delivery would trigger an ingrained cultural expectation of goodwill and forgiveness. She had played me from hundreds of miles away, and I had nearly fallen into the trap before the wrapping paper hit the floor. "You are right," I whispered, the relief curdling into something sharp and bitter in my throat. "She never does anything without a calculation." Noah nodded, his expression grim. He did not boast about catching what I missed. He did not need to. He had spent the past 5 years helping me rebuild the shattered ruins of my life, scraping my family's legacy back from the brink of total annihilation. He knew exactly what Vanessa's absence had cost us in sweat, in tears, in sleepless nights, and terrifying bank meetings. He knew her sudden return was not a miracle. "We are not opening this tonight," Noah stated. He picked up the velvet box, handling it by the very edges, treating it like a piece of unexploded ordnance. "I am putting it in the safe. We will deal with it tomorrow, with clear heads." I could only nod. I followed him down the hall to his home office. The room was dark, smelling faintly of leather and old paper. Noah crouched in front of the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner. He spun the dial, the mechanical clicks echoing loudly in the silent house. He swung the heavy door open, placed the bright red box on the top shelf, and slammed the steel door shut. The metallic thud felt distressingly final. We went back to the kitchen. We ate the rib roast. We drank the wine. We pretended the evening had not been fundamentally altered, but the silence between us was heavy and thick. Long after Noah had fallen asleep, I slipped out of bed. The hardwood floors were cold against my bare feet as I walked back down the hallway to the office. I did not turn on the light. I simply stood in the doorway, staring into the dark corner where the safe sat. Behind those steel walls sat a red velvet box with my name written in my dead mother's handwriting. Vanessa was out there. After 5 years of silence, she had finally spoken, and as I stood shivering in the dark on Christmas night, the terrible, sinking realization took root in my chest. The reconciliation I had foolishly hoped for had arrived, but it was disguised. It was an ambush dressed up in holiday ribbon, The war I thought I had won 5 years ago was only just beginning. Harbor Vale Cold Link was never a glamorous enterprise. We did not build sleek consumer applications or trade high-frequency stocks. We moved the fragile, invisible things that kept the medical infrastructure of Western Pennsylvania and Ohio functioning. My parents built a regional cold chain logistics company from the ground up, starting with one leased truck and expanding into a fleet of specialized refrigerated trailers. We transported volatile lab samples, highly sensitive oncology medications, and temperature-critical hospital supplies. In our industry, the margin for error was non-existent. A fluctuation of 2 degrees over an hour could render a payload of chemotherapy drugs completely toxic. We sold trust. We sold the guarantee that the cold chain would never break. The collapse, when it finally came, was not born from a sudden, cinematic disaster. There was no grand embezzlement or hostile corporate raid. It was a terrifyingly modern chain reaction, a slow-motion avalanche triggered by hidden corporate cowardice and quiet, everyday betrayals. It started with the technology we relied on to keep our promises. Our third-party software vendor quietly pushed a firmware update to our trailer monitoring systems. The update contained a critical flaw that caused the remote refrigeration alerts to lag by several hours. When the temperature dropped or spiked, the system would silently register the failure, but delay sending the emergency notification to our dispatch center. The vendor discovered the bug in their beta testing, but internal emails later proved they deliberately concealed the issue to avoid a costly, humiliating public recall. They gambled with our operations to protect their quarterly stock price. Simultaneously, a rot had set in closer to home. Our senior fleet manager, a man who had worked for my father for nearly a decade, had been systematically falsifying the manual maintenance logs. Under pressure to keep his departmental spending down and secure his annual performance bonus, he skipped routine compressor services and logged phantom repairs on the cooling units. These two betrayals collided on a Tuesday morning in late October. A major hospital network in Cleveland received a massive, high-priority shipment of specialty biologics. Because the fleet manager had skipped the maintenance, the compressor on trailer number 4 failed on the highway. Because the software vendor had concealed their bug, our dispatch center did not receive the critical temperature drop alert until 4 hours later. The entire shipment was spoiled upon arrival. The fallout was absolute and immediate. The hospital network terminated our primary contract before the end of the business day. The moment the news of the spoiled biologics circulated, the liability claims began pouring in, threatening millions of dollars in damages. Our commercial insurers conducted a rapid audit, discovered the falsified maintenance logs, and immediately invoked a negligence clause to deny all coverage. Once the insurance shield evaporated, the real bleeding began. Our regional lender panicked and instantly froze our revolving credit line. The lifeblood of the company vanished overnight. Dozens of refrigerated trucks sat idled in the gravel yard, their engines dead. We had furious clients threatening litigation, fuel vendors demanding certified bank checks before they would pump a single gallon of diesel, and a massive looming payroll risk that threatened to leave our drivers empty-handed right before the holidays. Every structural weakness we had was exposed at the exact same moment. My father refused to let his life's work die. He was a proud, fiercely stubborn man who genuinely believed that sheer force of will could outmaneuver compound interest. He moved a cot into the dispatch office and practically stopped sleeping. I watched him try to hold the operation together with nothing but a landline and pure desperation. He ran brutal audit meetings from dawn until dusk, dialed predatory emergency financing groups across different time zones, and spent hours on the phone with legal reviewers begging for a temporary stay of execution on our debts. He was 62 years old, but in those final weeks, he aged a decade. The stress hollowed him out, turning his skin gray and making his hands shake constantly. The end came on a Thursday. He was preparing for an all-night negotiation call with our largest unsecured creditor, trying to restructure a debt we simply could not service. I left him at his desk at 9 o'clock at night, surrounded by stacks of unpaid invoices and legal demands. Sometime before sunrise, his heart finally surrendered to the pressure. He suffered a massive, fatal stroke right there in the dispatch office. The morning shift supervisor found him slumped over his keyboard, the negotiation papers still clutched in his hand. My mother, already emotionally fragile and deeply exhausted by the escalating crisis, completely spiraled after his death. She had always preferred the social prestige of being a successful business owner's wife to the gritty, stressful reality of logistics management. Without my father to shield her from the brutal arithmetic of our ruin, she simply broke. At first, she tried to maintain the illusion of control. She wore her designer clothes, attended her weekly luncheons, and politely smiled through the whispered gossip about our impending bankruptcy, but the facade required too much energy. She retreated to the house, locked the doors, and quietly stopped taking care of herself. When she developed a severe respiratory infection a few months later, she refused to see a doctor. She ignored the fever and the coughing until it escalated into systemic sepsis. She died in the intensive care unit, a woman who had simply run out of the desire to keep surviving. At 34 years old, I was left entirely alone in the wreckage. I did not inherit a gleaming business empire or a comfortable trust fund. I inherited a half-ruined logistical operation, 3 active corporate lawsuits, aggressive repossession notices taped to the doors of our fleet, and a warehouse full of terrified, loyal employees begging me for answers I did not yet have. I remember the profound isolation of our mother's funeral. I spent the morning of the burial standing in the chilly vestibule of the church, frantically reviewing floral invoices and signing preliminary probate paperwork on a clipboard provided by the estate attorney. I was running on empty, my stomach churning with anxiety about how I was going to cover the next payroll cycle. Then, there was Vanessa. My sister had flown in from Miami the night before, bringing her wealthy husband, Miles, and an aura of profound irritation. During the service, while I stood in the back negotiating a payment plan with the cemetery director, Vanessa sat in the front pew, completely detached from the reality of the room. She was wearing a tailored morning dress and a dark, wide-brimmed hat. She did not weep. She did not approach the casket. Instead, she kept her head bowed, staring at the glowing screen of her phone hidden in her lap, furiously typing messages. Every few minutes, she would lean over and speak in hushed, annoyed whispers to Miles, who looked like he was calculating how quickly they could get back to the airport. She did not offer to help sort through the legal mess. She did not ask how I was managing the debt. She did not even ask if I had eaten that day. She was physically present, but she had already completely checked out of our shared existence. Watching her slide her phone back into her designer purse, looking annoyed that the eulogy was running long, a cold, hard clarity washed over me. That was the exact moment I finally understood the fundamental truth of my bloodline. Our family was not merely grieving a dual tragedy. We were not united in our sorrow. We were actively fracturing, splitting permanently down the middle. We had become 2 distinct entities, the one who would stay and bleed to clean up the ruins, and the one who would run at the first sight of the fire. Exactly 14 days after the dirt settled over our mother, I sat at the main dispatch desk, staring at a stack of final notices. The heating system in the warehouse had failed overnight, and the office was freezing, my breath pluming faintly in the air. I had spent the last 72 hours untangling the immediate cash flow disaster, and the mathematics were uncompromising. I did not need a miraculous rescue. I did not need someone to step in and solve the systemic issues. What I needed was practical, blunt force help, a temporary infusion of capital to bridge the gap. I needed just enough liquid cash to keep the commercial auto insurance premiums current, to make payroll for our remaining drivers by Friday, and to preserve our hold on the last few profitable hospital routes until I could execute a formal restructuring plan. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver of the landline and dialed Vanessa's cell phone. She answered on the 5th ring. The background noise bled through the earpiece immediately, a sharp, jarring contrast to the silence of my frozen office. I heard the rhythmic, heavy bass of tropical lounge music, the clinking of expensive glassware, and the loud, overlapping chatter of a wealthy crowd. She was at a luxury hotel in Miami, surrounded by people who did not know what it meant to panic over a utility bill. "What is it, Helena?" she asked. Her voice was clipped, carrying a profound layer of annoyance, as if I were a persistent telemarketer who had managed to bypass her screening process. "We are in the middle of a poolside brunch." I forced my grip on the phone to relax. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone entirely level, presenting the situation as a business proposition rather than a plea. I explained the exact amount of temporary capital required to keep the remaining trucks legally on the road. I outlined the 30-day survival plan. I promised her a secure repayment schedule once the restructuring was complete. "I am not asking you to take over," I told her. The phone pressed hard against my ear. "I am just asking for a bridge loan. We need to stabilize the floor before the entire foundation cracks." Vanessa let out a short, hollow laugh that cut straight through the ambient noise of her brunch. It was the kind of laugh reserved for a naive child. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she asked, her tone shifting from annoyed to patronizing. "You want me to throw cash into a burning building. You are talking about that company like it is a viable asset. Helena, it is a dirty inheritance. It is a financial sinkhole that no intelligent person would touch with a 10-foot pole. It is a salvageable operation," I pushed back, my chest tightening. "The core routes are still profitable if we just clear the immediate hurdles." "I refuse to bleed for a dead business," she snapped, the words landing like stones on the desk between us. "I am not going to let you drag me down into this mess. I never approved of the massive, idiotic risks they took. I told them years ago they were over-leveraged, but nobody listened to me. Now the bill has come due, and I am certainly not paying it." She was rewriting history in real time, positioning herself as the ignored visionary rather than the absent daughter. I felt a surge of hot, desperate anger, but I swallowed it down. I tried to strip away the corporate jargon and appeal to the only thing we had left in common. "Vanessa, listen to me," I said, my voice dropping lower. "This is not some abstract corporate debt portfolio. This is the last surviving piece of our parents' life's work. It is the only thing they left behind. If we let the insurance lapse on Friday, the state revokes our operating authority, the company dies. Everything they built over 30 years vanishes by the end of the week." I expected that to give her pause. I expected, at the very least, a moment of silent reflection. Instead, she became infinitely colder. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a chilling, absolute detachment. "Let me be perfectly clear so we do not have to have this conversation again," Vanessa said, speaking with the measured, defensive cadence of a corporate attorney. "I formally renounce any and all operational roles in Harbor Vale Cold Link. I refuse any future liability, personal or professional, connected to that entity. I will not contribute a single dollar to your restructuring fantasy." She paused, and I could hear her taking a sip of something over the line. "You need to stop playing the tragic hero. Helena," she continued. "Liquidate the trucks, sell the warehouse for scrap, file the bankruptcy papers and walk away before this mess destroys your own life too. I am hanging up now." The line went dead. I did not move. I held the receiver against my ear, listening to the dial tone echo in the freezing room. What stung the most, what truly settled into my bones like frost, was not the financial refusal itself. It was the sheer, breathtaking calculation of her cruelty. Vanessa wanted to have it both ways. She demanded the emotional right to remain the injured, grieving daughter in her social circles, playing the victim of a sudden family tragedy. Yet, simultaneously, she was aggressively abandoning every adult consequence of that tragedy. She wanted the sympathy of the aftermath without lifting a single finger to help clean up the blood. She had completely cut herself off from our world. I set the phone back in its cradle. The silence in the dispatch center was absolute. I did not cry. I think I was too exhausted to summon the tears. Instead, I stood up and walked over to the main sorting table in the center of the room. I grabbed the heavy cardboard boxes of paperwork that the accountants had left behind and dumped them across the metal surface. I spent the rest of the night entirely alone under the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. I did not stop for water. I did not sit down. I worked through the agonizing quiet of the warehouse, taking the physical weight of our ruin and forcing it into order. I sorted the chaos into distinct, actionable piles. On the left, I stacked the remaining profitable hospital route schedules, the clean contracts that proved we still had a pulse. In the center, I piled the critical debt notices, the utility warnings, and the insurance premiums that required immediate, aggressive negotiation. On the right, I stacked the vendor agreements that needed to be severed by dawn. Every piece of paper I touched was a heavy, calculated decision that would dictate whether this company lived to see the following Monday. The hours bled together. The temperature in the room plummeted further, but I barely felt it. I was operating on a strange, high-wire adrenaline, fueled by the sheer necessity of survival. By the time the clock on the wall read 6 o'clock in the morning, the sky outside the frosted warehouse windows began to turn a pale, bruised purple. The first rays of sunrise hit the gravel yard, illuminating the silent, white refrigerated trailers parked in neat rows outside. I stood over the table, looking at the perfectly organized piles of paper. I had mapped the exact dimensions of the disaster, and I knew exactly what it would cost me to fix it. I would have to sell my own assets. I would have to beg for mercy from local creditors. I would have to sacrifice years of my life to the brutal, grinding reality of debt management. But as the morning light washed over the dispatch floor, I made my final choice. I chose the harder road. I was not going to save the business out of some blind, foolish nostalgia for my parents. I was not going to do it to honor a past that was already gone. I was going to save it, because letting it collapse right now, simply surrendering to the void based on Vanessa's cowardly logic, would mean that she was right. It would mean surrendering the only tangible truth left in our family to a woman who chose brunch over her own blood. I would rebuild the foundation stone by stone, not for them, and certainly not for her, but because walking away was a luxury I refused to afford. Noah did not leave his lucrative career in commercial design technology because he wanted to play the role of a romantic savior. He resigned because we sat at our chipped kitchen table on a Tuesday night, staring at a massive, unforgiving spreadsheet, and realized the mathematics of survival required a brutal sacrifice. We simply could not afford to hire a competent director of operations, and I could not physically run dispatch, secure new sales, and manage our aggressive legal defense simultaneously without my heart giving out. "I am putting in my notice tomorrow morning," Noah said quietly, his eyes scanning the red ink on the screen. There was no grand, cinematic declaration of devotion. It was the heavy, pragmatic resignation of a partner choosing to step into the trenches because the alternative was watching me drown. We spent the next 2 years systematically dismantling the comfortable life we had built together. We broke the lease on our spacious downtown apartment and moved into a cramped, drafty one-bedroom unit located 3 miles from the industrial park. I sold the vintage platinum and diamond earrings my grandmother had left me for a fraction of their appraised value, just to cover a sudden spike in commercial diesel prices during our first winter. We stopped pretending that weekends were a real concept. Saturdays were dedicated to grueling preventative maintenance on the older, unreliable trucks, and Sundays were spent at the kitchen table, desperately balancing an erratic ledger. Our marriage ceased to be about dinner reservations or quiet Sunday mornings. It became a crucible sustained by shared route sheets, frantic phone calls about alternator repair bills, and grueling, early morning hospital delivery windows. There were nights when we fell into bed at 3 in the morning, our bodies aching, our hands smelling faintly of industrial hand sanitizer and diesel exhaust, too exhausted to even speak to one another. But the shared, crushing burden forged an unbreakable, calloused bond between us. Noah never once complained about the vanished paycheck or the lost vacations. We were a single unit operating against a hostile world. I took a machete to my father's old business strategy. He had been obsessed with national expansion, constantly chasing massive, low-margin freight contracts that stretched our aging fleet dangerously thin across the country. I pivoted Harbor Vale Coldlink sharply away from that risky dream. I pulled our trucks out of the long-haul routes and shrank our operational footprint entirely. We were going to become hyper-regional, focusing exclusively on smaller, high-trust medical routes across western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, where absolute reliability mattered significantly more than flashy, unsustainable growth. I spent my days living out of my sedan, driving through endless sleet and rain to meet with skeptical lab administrators, rigid compliance officers, and exhausted clinic managers. I did not wear expensive suits, and I did not try to sell them a polished corporate fantasy. I sat in their fluorescent-lit offices, looked them directly in the eye, and promised them exactly what our company had fatally failed to provide in the past. "We are offering complete transparency," I told the lead procurement director of a major fertility clinic during a tense, 2-hour negotiation. "You will have real-time traceable temperature logs delivered directly to your secure server. If a compressor even stutters by a single degree, you will receive the alert before my driver does. And there will be absolutely no lies. If we fail, we eat the entire cost of the payload, and we tell you the truth immediately. We are not hiding behind vendors anymore." While I was out selling accountability, Noah was inside the warehouse ruthlessly enforcing it. He brought his highly analytical background in systems architecture into the chaotic, blue-collar world of cold chain logistics. He rebuilt our operational discipline from the ground up, completely replacing the dangerous shortcut culture my father's former fleet managers had allowed to fester. Every single procedure, from loading dock staging to emergency defrost cycles, was meticulously documented, standardized, and tracked. Noah fired 2 veteran drivers on his 3rd week because they bypassed a mandatory pre-trip refrigeration check to save 15 minutes. He stood in the freezing trailers, his breath pluming in the artificial cold, relentlessly drilling the remaining crew on the new protocols. "One unchecked alert does not just mean a spoiled box," Noah explained to a room full of seasoned, hardened drivers, his voice projecting over the low hum of the warehouse generators. "One unchecked alert destroys a contract. It destroys our reputation, and it permanently destroys your jobs. We do not guess the temperature in this facility. We verify it, every single time." Slowly, the bleeding stopped. The aggressive lawsuits brought by the former clients were settled out of court for mere cents on the dollar, heavily mitigated by the undeniable evidence we had uncovered proving the software vendors' deliberate negligence. Our commercial lenders, seeing our ruthless cost-cutting measures and our slowly rising profit margins on the new, specialized regional routes, finally softened their hostile stance. We stopped being viewed as a distressed asset and started becoming a functional, highly disciplined business again. Through clean audits, flawless delivery records, and brutal honesty, we earned back the absolute most valuable thing we had lost: our credibility. Fast forward 5 years. The landscape was entirely unrecognizable. Harbor Vale Coldlink was not merely solvent. We were actively thriving. The hyper-regional strategy had paid off massively. We dominated the local specialty medical routes, becoming the preferred carrier for regional blood banks and compounding pharmacies. Noah had successfully designed and implemented a proprietary, heavily redundant monitoring system that made temperature deviations practically impossible to miss. We were so financially healthy that larger, national logistics firms, the very same private equity firms that had confidently assumed we would vanish into bankruptcy half a decade ago, were now sending quiet, highly lucrative acquisition inquiries to my legal team. We had survived the fire. We had rebuilt the house brick by brick, which brought everything sharply back to the heavy red velvet box sitting inside the steel safe in Noah's home office. Because the most chilling, terrifying detail of my sister's sudden reappearance was not the luxury private courier, and it was not the manipulative, forged handwriting on the envelope. It was the exact, calculated timing of the delivery. On the morning of the 24th of December, just 1 day before Vanessa's package arrived on my snow-covered porch, I had logged into our commercial banking portal. With a deep, shuddering breath, I had clicked a button and initiated a final wire transfer of $42,000. It was the very last payment on the massive, suffocating legacy debt my father had left behind. After 5 agonizing, bone-breaking years, Harbor Vale Cold Link was officially entirely debt-free. We were operating with pure, unencumbered equity, flush with cash and highly valuable contracts. Nobody outside of Noah, myself, and our lead corporate accountant knew that final payment had cleared the bank. Yet, exactly 36 hours after the company officially became a highly lucrative, debt-free asset, the sister who had treated it like a contagious disease suddenly decided it was time to reconnect. The timeline was far too precise, far too perfectly aligned with our balance sheet, to be driven by holiday sentimentality or spontaneous sibling guilt. As I sat in the dark on Christmas night, the final piece of the puzzle locked into place. The velvet box was not an apology for her past cowardice. It was a perfectly timed, highly orchestrated claim on the future I had bled to build. On the morning of the 26th of December, the snow was already turning into a gritty gray slush on the streets of downtown Pittsburgh. I did not drive to the warehouse. Instead, I sat rigidly in a heavy leather chair inside the high-rise office of Evelyn Sloan. Evelyn was a disciplined, surgical corporate litigator. She did not handle standard family law or emotional mediations. She handled hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and vicious shareholder disputes. She treated family conflict with the exact same ruthless caution she applied to a corporate raid. When I called her at 7 o'clock that morning and described the private courier and the tampered seal, she instructed me to bring the package directly to her conference room and forbade me from touching the ribbon. The red velvet box sat in the center of her massive mahogany conference table. Evelyn did not open it like a gift. She handled it like forensic evidence. Wearing thin latex gloves, she used a silver letter opener to carefully snip the satin ribbon, making sure not to disturb the knot. She lifted the velvet lid and set it aside. The interior of the box was a masterpiece of layered, psychological performance. Resting on a bed of white silk was a heavy, polished silver ornament, delicately engraved with our parents' initials and the year they founded Harbor Vale Cold Link. Tucked beside it was a thick, cream-colored greeting card. Evelyn used tweezers to extract the card, opening it flat on the table. The message was written in that same haunting, perfectly replicated looping script. It spoke of forgiveness, of missing the family, and of a deep, sudden desire to be coming home for the holidays. "It is beautifully executed," Evelyn said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. She did not read the sentimental words. Her eyes were scanning the physical structure of the paper itself. "But it is heavily staged. Let us see what is underneath the floorboards." She removed the silver ornament, then slid the letter opener around the edges of the white silk insert. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she popped the entire velvet and silk tray out of the box. Lying flat against the cardboard bottom was a tightly bound, legal-sized document packet. A cold sweat broke across the back of my neck. My stomach twisted into a violent knot. Evelyn carefully spread the documents across the mahogany table. The trap my sister had laid was not just malicious. It was elegant, highly technical, and unimaginably vicious. The seemingly innocent Christmas greeting card was actually the top sheet of a multi-part carbon-backed legal form. Evelyn pointed the tip of her pen at a faint, nearly invisible line of tiny indentations running along the bottom edge of the card, right below where Vanessa had written a prompt asking for my signature to confirm I had received her olive branch. "Look closely at the grain of the paper," Evelyn instructed, leaning over the table. "It is a perforated edge. If you had felt emotional last night, if you had picked up a pen and signed the bottom of that sentimental card where she asked you to, your signature would have bled directly through to the document hidden beneath the silk." I stared at the hidden packet. The header on the primary document was printed in bold, stark letters. It was a proxy authorization form. "If you had signed that card," Evelyn continued, her tone deadpan and clinical, "you would have unknowingly executed a binding transfer of temporary voting control over your majority shares in Harbor Vale Cold Link. The justification listed here is an estate reconciliation review. They would have separated your signature from the greeting card, attached it to this proxy, and filed it before the banks opened on Monday morning." The sheer scale of the manipulation stole the air from my lungs. One careless signature born out of a desperate, foolish hope for a sisterly reconciliation would have handed my entire life over to her. Once she had temporary proxy control, she could have immediately triggered an emergency internal control dispute. She could have frozen our operating accounts, suspended my authority to sign payroll, and paralyzed the entire company within 24 hours. Vanessa is not smart enough to draft this, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of profound betrayal and rising adrenaline. She knows how to hurt me emotionally, but she does not know the first thing about proxy authorizations or corporate governance. She thought the company was a joke. You are exactly right, Evelyn replied, gathering the documents into a neat stack. This paperwork is far too sophisticated for a clumsy family scam. The inclusion of the Estate Reconciliation Review Clause is a highly specialized legal maneuver. Furthermore, this document references specific corporate bylaws regarding emergency shareholder interventions that your sister should not even know exist. She is absolutely not acting alone. She has institutional backing. Evelyn immediately activated her network. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she had a private corporate investigator pulling the metadata from the drafting language and running the specific boilerplate text through a proprietary legal database. The results came back before the sun set, and they shattered any remaining illusion that this was simply a bitter sibling rivalry. The investigator traced the structural language of the proxy trap to a boutique law firm operating out of Chicago. That firm functioned as the primary external counsel for a massive entity known as North Barrow Holdings. North Barrow Holdings was not a logistics partner. They were a predatory private equity group entirely famous within the financial sector for buying up distressed, mid-sized supply chain assets. Their entire business model relied on engineering internal crises. They would identify a profitable, privately held company, find a disgruntled board member or an alienated family shareholder, fund a hostile internal coup to freeze the operations, and then swoop in to purchase the paralyzed, panicked company for pennies on the dollar during the ensuing chaos. They were corporate vultures, and my sister had just given them the map to our front door. But vultures do not work for free, and they certainly do not partner with absent sisters unless there is a desperate, highly leverageable motive. The investigator dug into Vanessa's current financial footprint, bypassing the glossy social media facade she maintained in Miami. The truth was violently ugly. Vanessa and her husband, Miles Holloway, were quietly and rapidly drowning. 3 years ago, Miles had heavily over-leveraged their personal assets to launch a massive chain of luxury wellness studios across southern Florida. The expansion was disastrous. We were looking at catastrophic lease defaults across 6 different commercial properties. The investigator uncovered aggressive tax liens filed by the federal government and millions of dollars in outstanding high-interest bridge loans that were currently in default. Their yachts, their cars, and their sprawling Miami estate were quietly being circled by creditors. They were weeks away from a humiliating, total public bankruptcy. I sat in Evelyn's office as the city lights flickered on outside the window, watching the complete picture assemble itself on the conference table. The red velvet box was never an apology. It was a Christmas-colored entry point for ruthless corporate outsiders who wanted to strip Harbor Vale Cold Link down to its copper wire. Vanessa had not returned because she missed me, or because she felt guilty about abandoning our father's legacy, or because she finally recognized the sheer agony Noah and I had endured to save the fleet. She had returned because she was a desperate, cornered animal. She had watched from afar as I spent 5 years scrubbing the blood off our family name and turning a ruined business into a multi-million-dollar prize. Now that she was facing her own ruin, she had simply decided to harvest my survival to pay her debts. She was willing to sell her own flesh and blood to a private equity firm just to secure the leverage she needed to maintain her country club memberships. "We are not dealing with a grieving sister anymore," Evelyn said quietly, locking the forged documents into a hardened steel briefcase. "We are dealing with a fully funded corporate siege, and they are going to strike again the moment they realize the proxy trap failed." I stood up from the leather chair. The shock and the humiliation from the night before had completely burned away, leaving nothing behind but a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. "Let them come," I said. The failed proxy trap was merely the opening salvo of a much larger, far more insidious war. Evelyn's forensic team did not stop digging when they identified the private equity firm backing my sister. By Tuesday afternoon, they had breached the perimeter of their secondary assault, uncovering the true, terrifying depth of the strategy. Vanessa and the corporate vultures at North Barrow Holdings were actively preparing to file a petition for emergency court intervention. Their legal strategy was designed to paint me as financially erratic, deeply paranoid, and psychologically compromised. They were going to argue to a judge that the crushing weight of a 5-year rebuilding effort had finally broken my mind, rendering me entirely unfit to manage a critical logistical infrastructure. However, they were not relying on archaic, easily disproven methods like forged psychiatric evaluations or fake medical histories. The attack was violently updated for the present day. They were weaponizing my own digital footprint against me. Evelyn spread the preliminary discovery files across the massive mahogany conference table. It was a masterclass in modern technological manipulation. There were internal memos I had written 3 years ago, violently altered to look like they were sent last week, suggesting I was actively hiding catastrophic financial losses from our regional lenders. There were manufactured email chains, carefully spliced together from dozens of unrelated, mundane conversations, engineered to make me sound confused and hostile toward my own staff. Most chilling of all were the audio files Evelyn played through her computer speakers. They had taken fragments of late-night voicemails I had left for our dispatch center during the absolute worst of our financial crisis. They had isolated the specific audio where my voice cracked from sheer exhaustion, stripped away the original context, and spliced the clips together. The resulting audio created a continuous, rambling, highly disturbing narrative of a chief executive rapidly losing her grip on reality. Evelyn paused the playback, the silence in the room feeling heavier than the manipulated recording. She explained the brutal, calculated logic behind the attack. "They do not need to win a prolonged trial," Evelyn told me, tapping her pen against the printed transcripts. "They only need to create enough sudden smoke to convince a judge to freeze the building. If they can secure a temporary injunction that suspends your operational authority for even 14 days, they win. The bank gets scared and freezes the credit line. The hospital networks panic and pull their supply contracts. Harbor Vale Coldlink bleeds out in a matter of weeks, forcing a rushed, distressed sale directly into the hands of North Barrow at a fraction of its actual value." The legal filing was only half of the blade. The other half was entirely social. Vanessa's side had already begun seeding a synchronized whisper campaign within our hyper-connected regional logistics network. Evelyn's industry monitors were picking up deliberate, manufactured chatter among local freight brokers. Anonymous sources were hinting that our newly installed remote monitoring systems were failing, and that I was actively concealing massive compliance violations regarding temperature control to keep the business afloat. In our industry, an accusation did not need to be proven in a court of law to be fatal. We moved highly volatile specialty medications and irreplaceable lab samples. A mere rumor of compromised cargo was more than enough to poison a multi-million-dollar hospital contract before the truth could even put its boots on. The strategy was to suffocate me with doubt from every conceivable angle. Sitting in that high-rise office, staring at the manipulated evidence and listening to the fabricated echoes of my own voice, a profound, suffocating paranoia set in. My hands began to shake, pressing hard against my knees to steady them. I was completely shaken, but not because their lies were inherently persuasive to me. I was shaken because the lies were meticulously, cruelly tailored from the very real, very raw fragments of my hardest years. The audio clip of me sounding hysterical was genuine. It was from a terrifying night 4 years ago when a refrigeration unit failed near Cleveland, and I thought we were going to lose everything we had left. The emails referencing severe exhaustion were real. I had sent them to Noah at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was surviving entirely on black coffee, adrenaline, and pure panic. They had taken my genuine trauma, my chronic insomnia, my private terror, and my justifiable anger, and they had repackaged it all into a clinical diagnosis of corporate instability. They were using my survival against me. I felt a hot, shameful flush of vulnerability crawl up my neck. I looked at Noah, who was sitting beside me, his posture rigid, his jaw locked tight with restrained fury. "I sound completely unhinged," I whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the transcript on the table. If a judge hears that audio without knowing the context, if the hospital administrators read these manufactured emails, they are going to think I actually broke. They are going to think the pressure finally destroyed me. Noah did not offer a gentle, passive comfort. He reached across the space between us and gripped my hand hard enough to ground me, physically anchoring me to the present moment. He refused to let the narrative shift, refusing to let Vanessa dictate how I viewed my own history. "Do not do that," Noah said firmly, his voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. His eyes burned with a fierce, protective anger. "Do not let them confuse your vulnerability with weakness. Do not let them turn your survival into a source of shame. You were exhausted because you were saving an empire with your bare hands, while your sister was sipping cocktails on a yacht. Bleeding for this company was not madness. It was the only sane response to the disaster we inherited. We know the exact truth of what it took to get here, and we are going to make them choke on it." His words hit me like a splash of freezing water, shattering the paralyzing dread. The shame evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. Evelyn, feeding off the shift in the room, did not offer emotional platitudes. She offered a concrete, impenetrable defensive wall. She stood up and began mobilizing her team with the precision of a military general facing a siege. "We are going to bury their digital illusions in absolute authenticity," Evelyn declared, her voice ringing with combative energy. She ordered the immediate compilation of every pristine, unaltered server log from the past 5 years to establish an unbreakable metadata chain of custody. She demanded my authentic, flawless health records from my primary care physician to counter the psychological narrative. She tasked her paralegals with gathering every clean, unanimous board minute, every glowing piece of bank correspondence praising our fiscal discipline, and every immaculate third-party audit trail that verified our temperature compliance down to the exact decimal. Furthermore, Evelyn refused to wait for the whisper campaign to reach our clients. She drafted sworn, binding legal declarations and sent them directly to our most vital partners via secure courier. She approached the exact same clinic managers and hospital administrators who had watched me rebuild the company from the dirt up, asking them to formally attest to our transparency and operational excellence in real time. We would preemptively arm the market with sworn facts before the rumors could take root. As I watched Evelyn orchestrate the massive, overwhelming counteroffensive, the true, horrifying scale of my sister's greed finally crystallized in my mind. Vanessa did not merely come back wanting a financial payout. She did not just want to steal the equity, or seize the trucks, or take the warehouse. That would have been ordinary theft. This was something far darker. She had come back hoping that the hardest, most agonizing years of my life could be actively weaponized to destroy me. She had studied the deep, grueling scars I had earned keeping our family name alive, and she had decided to use those exact same scars to slit my throat. Evelyn Sloan did not build her reputation by merely reacting to the attacks of her enemies. She built it by digging beneath the battlefield and planting her own explosives. While North Barrow Holdings and my sister were busy drafting their emergency petitions, attempting to paint me as an unstable woman crumbling under pressure, Evelyn deployed her paralegals into the deepest, dustiest corners of my family's legal history. She demanded every single piece of archival paper associated with my parents, refusing to believe the narrative we had been operating under was the complete truth. The breakthrough happened late on a Thursday night. We were sitting in the conference room, surrounded by towering stacks of banker boxes. Evelyn had noticed a glaring discrepancy in the personal banking ledgers from the final year of my mother's life. Among the usual charges for pharmacy deliveries and utility bills, there was a quiet, isolated retainer payment made to an independent, highly secretive estate planning firm located on the opposite side of the city. It was a firm our family corporate counsel had never interacted with. Evelyn immediately drafted a subpoena and sent a courier across town at dawn. What the courier brought back in a sealed manila envelope completely shifted the tectonic plates of our defense. Exactly 6 months before she succumbed to her untreated infection, my mother had quietly executed a formal amendment to the foundational family trust. She was fragile, yes, and she had spent her final days hiding from the reality of our collapsing business, but she had not been entirely blind. According to the private notes attached to the legal file, my mother had discovered a deeply guarded secret. While my father was still alive, literally working himself into an early grave trying to satisfy creditors, Vanessa had quietly attempted to leverage her anticipated future inheritance to secure a massive commercial loan for a luxury real estate purchase down in Florida. My mother had recognized the sheer, breathtaking greed of that maneuver. In a rare moment of absolute ironclad lucidity, she had driven across the city and rewritten the rules of our inheritance. Evelyn spread the crisp, heavy pages of the amended trust across the mahogany table, tracing the critical paragraph with the tip of her silver pen. The legal language was not merely a sentimental gesture favoring the daughter who stayed, it was a lethal, springing trap. The clause explicitly dictated that if Harbor Vale Coldlink ever faced a catastrophic restructuring, and if Vanessa formally refused her operational and financial obligations to the estate during that crisis, she would instantly and permanently forfeit all corporate governance and voting rights. Complete, unquestionable sole controlling authority over the entire operation would legally default to me. This clause would have ended everything instantly on the day of the funeral, I whispered, staring at my mother's shaky signature at the bottom of the page. Why did I never see this? Why was this not in the primary probate binder? Because your mother was terrified, Evelyn explained, her voice sharp with admiration for the dead woman's strategy. She knew that if Vanessa's husband, Miles, found out about this amendment, he would have bullied your mother into retracting it before she died. So, she instructed this independent attorney to hold the duplicate original in a private vault. It was entirely dormant, instructed to be released only if Vanessa ever formally contested the company's operations after abandoning it. It was a staggering revelation, a ghost reaching out from the grave to hand me a shield. But Evelyn was a pragmatist. A conditional clause required absolute proof that the condition had been met. We needed undeniable, documented evidence that Vanessa had explicitly refused her obligations during the collapse. We needed to prove her abandonment was a hostile choice, not the grief-driven confusion her lawyers were currently claiming in their court filings. That proof came from the most unexpected source. The following morning, I drove out to the quiet suburbs to visit Marlene. Marlene was our retired lead dispatcher, a woman with a spine of pure steel who had held the chaotic warehouse together during the absolute darkest days of our financial ruin. She had retired 2 years ago with a generous pension I had personally ensured was fully funded. I sat at her small kitchen table, the smell of freshly brewed black tea filling the warm room, and explained the terrifying legal assault Vanessa was mounting against the company. Marlene listened in complete silence. Her face hardened, the deep lines around her mouth setting into a mask of pure indignation. She did not offer me pity. She stood up, walked down the narrow hallway to her home office, and returned carrying a heavy, outdated digital tape recorder. "I never throw anything away, Helena," Marlene said softly, placing the black plastic device on the table between us. "Especially not from that month. We were fighting for our lives in that dispatch office." I recorded the incoming emergency lines because I needed to keep the vendor threats documented for the lawyers. She pressed a heavy plastic button. The tape hissed, winding back through time. Then, Vanessa's voice filled the quiet, sunlit kitchen. It was a recording from the second week of the collapse, the exact same week I had called Vanessa begging for temporary capital. Marlene had apparently called her right afterward, desperately trying to get an emergency signature on a fuel authorization form. "Stop calling me. Marlene," Vanessa's recorded voice snapped, dripping with absolute disdain and annoyance. The background noise of the Miami resort was perfectly clear. I am not signing anything. I am not authorizing any fuel payments. I want nothing. Not the debt, not the trucks, not the company, not any of it. Tell Helena she is entirely on her own. Do not contact this number again. I closed my eyes as the tape clicked off. The air in my lungs felt dangerously thin. That recording was completely devastating. It was not a misunderstood conversation. It was a silver bullet. It proved, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that Vanessa's abandonment was a conscious, fully articulated, and vicious refusal to participate in the survival of the business. She had verbally triggered my mother's hidden trust clause without even realizing it. But the final, most terrifying piece of the puzzle did not emerge from our past. It emerged from the shadows of my own rebuilding effort. While I was meeting with Marlene, Evelyn's private investigators had been tearing into the digital footprint of Vanessa's husband. They were looking for the exact moment the conspiracy with North Barrow Holdings began. What they found proved that my sister's betrayal was infinitely colder than a sudden desperate cash grab. Evelyn called me as I was driving back to the city. Her investigators had located a man named Marcus, a former operations coordinator who had worked for me during the first 3 years of our grueling recovery. I had quietly terminated Marcus 36 months ago for a series of minor, unexplained compliance violations. They squeezed him, Evelyn told me over the car's Bluetooth speaker, her voice vibrating with aggressive triumph. Marcus just admitted everything in a sworn affidavit to avoid a corporate espionage charge. 36 months ago, Vanessa secretly reached out to him. She paid him thousands of dollars through a blind shell company to export highly confidential route volume data, client renewal schedules, and projected profit margins from your internal servers. I pulled my car over to the shoulder of the highway, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She has been watching me, I said, the reality of the violation making my stomach churn. She has been monitoring the numbers for 3 years. Exactly, Evelyn confirmed. She did not suddenly remember her sister on Christmas night. She has been actively, secretly probing the company's commercial value from the shadows. She watched you bleed. She watched you suffer. And she simply waited until the balance sheet looked profitable enough to steal. The lingering, foolish pain I had carried in my chest for the sister I had lost finally vanished entirely. It sharpened into a brilliant, blinding clarity. What had initially looked like a sudden return was actually an exercise in delayed opportunism. She had timed her emotional ambush to the exact moment Harbor Vale Coldlink became an attractive, risk-free asset to predatory private equity money. I pulled back onto the highway, driving straight to Evelyn's high-rise office. When I walked into the conference room, Evelyn was standing in front of the massive glass whiteboard, capping a black dry erase marker. We no longer merely possessed a defensive wall of clean audits and health records. Evelyn had constructed something infinitely more dangerous. She had mapped out a concrete, undeniable timeline. The board displayed the hidden trust amendment showing intent, Marlene's tape recording showing the legal waiver, and the sworn affidavit from the operations coordinator proving deliberate concealment and corporate espionage. We finally had a coordinated, fully weaponized narrative that proved my sister and North Barrow Holdings had engineered a malicious plan to create artificial distress for pure financial profit. The investigative family mystery had been completely unraveled, and all the buried secrets had surfaced at the exact right moment to load the gun. I was reviewing the newly finalized regional compliance schedules on a Wednesday afternoon when the heavy metal door to my warehouse office swung open without a single knock. The sheer audacity of the entrance made me look up from my screen. Vanessa stepped over the threshold, bringing the bitter chill of the warehouse floor in with her. She was dressed like a woman arriving for a high-fashion editorial photo shoot rather than a visit to an active logistics hub. She wore a pristine, cream-colored cashmere coat draped over her shoulders, paired with sharp designer stiletto heels that clicked aggressively against the scuffed industrial linoleum. Against the backdrop of peeling paint and the faint, permanent smell of diesel fuel, she looked entirely alien. She did not offer a greeting. She walked directly to my scarred wooden desk and dropped a sleek, black leather folder right on top of my open ledger. The heavy thud sounded like a gavel striking a block. She placed it there with the absolute, unearned confidence of someone who believed the hostile takeover was already an accomplished fact. "It is time we had an adult conversation, Helena," Vanessa said. Her tone was shockingly syrupy, dripping with a manufactured, maternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "I am here to help you out of this nightmare." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I did not touch the folder. "I am perfectly awake, Vanessa. And my company is running exactly as it should. Your company—" She offered a soft, pitying smile, shaking her head as she took a seat in the metal guest chair opposite me. She crossed her legs, arranging her coat perfectly. "Oh, sweetheart, we both know that is not true. I have seen the toll this place has taken on you. You look exhausted. You look frantic. I am offering you a very simple, very quiet way out before you completely shatter." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the leather folder. "Inside is a clean, private governance transfer," she explained, her voice remaining perfectly smooth and calm. "You sign the controlling shares over to me. We avoid the ugly, public embarrassment of a courtroom battle where your mental stability becomes a matter of public record. In exchange, I arrange a very generous monthly stipend for you and Noah. You get to walk away and finally rest, and I will bring in real professionals to scale the company properly, the way our father always intended." A hot, dangerous spike of rage flared in my chest. It was not the threat of the lawsuit that enraged me. It was the specific, twisted vocabulary she was deploying. She was actively stealing the language of care and concern to deliver a profound humiliation. She was framing herself as the rational, benevolent sister returning from exile to mercifully save me from a crushing pressure she claimed I was obviously no longer equipped to carry. She was wrapping an act of corporate slaughter in the ribbon of sibling intervention. "Professionals," I repeated, keeping my voice entirely flat. "You mean the corporate raiders who drafted your proxy trap?" Vanessa did not flinch. She simply waved her hand, dismissing the accusation as if it were a trivial misunderstanding. "I have retained North Barrow Holdings in a strictly advisory capacity. They are experts in maximizing regional supply chains. They are simply acting as my harmless advisory relationship to ensure the transition is smooth and profitable for everyone." At that moment, the door to the office opened wider. Noah stepped inside. He did not say a word. He quietly closed the door behind him and leaned back against the frame, crossing his arms over his chest. He was wearing his heavy canvas work jacket, his boots stained with oil from the yard. Vanessa glanced at him, her syrupy smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She had clearly expected her sudden arrival to trigger visible panic. She expected Noah to shout, to threaten her, or to desperately beg her to reconsider. She expected to walk into a room filled with cornered, terrified prey. Instead, she found a room that had already made the active choice not to fear her. Noah's absolute, unwavering silence unnerved her deeply. He just watched her, his eyes cold and analytical, studying her like a structural flaw in a building he was about to demolish. I did not explode. I did not raise my voice or hurl the black folder across the room. Evelyn had trained me perfectly for this exact confrontation. I needed Vanessa to feel victorious so she would become careless. "Let me make sure I fully comprehend your position," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. "You want me to surrender the equity. You want me to step down today. Walk me through your specific justification for this demand. Vanessa, tell me exactly why you believe you deserve controlling authority now, after you explicitly refused to carry a single ounce of the risk when the company was broken." Vanessa scoffed, clearly irritated that I was forcing her to state her case aloud instead of simply surrendering. Arrogance had always been her fatal flaw. She was so convinced that her legal ambush was flawless, so certain that victory was only days away, that she could not resist the urge to gloat. "Because you are too emotional to see the reality of the board," she said, her tone dropping the fake sweetness and sharpening into cold condescension. "You think hard work equals ownership. It does not. Leverage equals ownership. And I hold all the leverage. She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, eager to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly she had cornered me. I know exactly how fragile your commercial standing really is, Helena, she said, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. I know your primary bank covenant review closes at the absolute end of this quarter. If I file my governance challenge tomorrow morning, the bank's automated risk algorithms will instantly flag the dispute. They will panic. They will freeze your revolving credit line before the close of business on Friday. Noah shifted his weight against the doorframe, but remained entirely silent. Vanessa took his movement as a sign of impending surrender and pressed harder. And we both know what happens when the credit line freezes, Vanessa continued, a cruel smile stretching across her face. You miss the payroll cycle next week. The drivers walk out. The hospital routes collapse within 48 hours. The resulting disruption makes a distressed sale to North Barrow Holdings entirely inevitable. You can either sign this private transfer today and walk away with a stipend, or you can stubbornly fight me in court and watch the bank burn your entire life to the ground by next Friday. The choice is yours, sweetheart. She stood up, smoothing the front of her cashmere coat. She looked down at me with absolute triumph. She believed she had just delivered a flawless checkmate. I suggest you review the paperwork, Vanessa said, turning toward the door. I expect your signature notarized and delivered to my hotel by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Noah simply stepped aside, opening the door for her without a single word. Vanessa walked out into the warehouse, her heels clicking away into the distance until the heavy metal door finally slammed shut, leaving the office in profound silence. I stared at the black leather folder sitting on my desk for a long time. Then, I looked up at the ceiling, right at the small, dark corner above the filing cabinets. Noah walked over to my desk and picked up the black folder. Tossing it casually into the nearest trash can, he pulled his phone from his pocket and typed a rapid message. Less than a minute later, my own phone buzzed on the desk. It was an encrypted message from Evelyn Sloan. The security system Noah had installed 3 years ago was not just designed to monitor the loading docks. The discreet camera in the corner of my office recorded in high-definition video and flawless, localized audio. Evelyn confirmed the feed had captured every single second of the confrontation. Vanessa had walked into my office entirely uninvited and arrogantly laid out her entire criminal strategy. We did not just have vague evidence of coercion anymore. We possessed crystal-clear, irrefutable video proof of her explicit intention to weaponize the banking timeline, manufacture a false reputational crisis, and deliberately freeze our payroll to force a hostile corporate sale. My sister thought she was delivering an ultimatum. She had absolutely no idea she had just delivered her own signed confession. The legal filing landed exactly when I feared it would, executed with the precision of a targeted missile strike. Vanessa formally petitioned the court for emergency relief on a Tuesday morning, claiming catastrophic mismanagement and requesting immediate outside intervention. The timing was not an accident. She dropped the bomb precisely 72 hours before our most critical multi-hospital contract was scheduled for renewal, and a mere 24 hours before a mandatory, high-stakes bank covenant review with our primary lenders. Almost simultaneously, the shadow campaign began. Anonymous industry emails started circulating through the tight-knit regional logistics network, heavily implying that Harbor Vale Coldlink was facing severe internal control issues. The damage was immediate. By Wednesday afternoon, I received a tense phone call from the regional director of supply chain at a major clinical network. His tone, usually warm and collaborative, was guarded. He informed me that his executive committee had decided to pause our renewal meeting pending a formal clarification of the rumors they had intercepted. In the world of cold chain logistics, a paused meeting was a death rattle. While I was managing the fallout with the hospital networks, North Barrow Holdings activated their ground operatives. They did not attack me directly. Instead, they circled the perimeter, identifying the 2 minor board advisors my father had appointed decades ago. These men were semi-retired, risk-averse, and entirely disconnected from the daily grind of our operations. North Barrow operatives quietly took them to expensive dinners behind my back, presenting themselves as stabilizing, highly capitalized investors. They offered these older men a comfortable, lucrative soft landing if they simply supported a temporary period of outside corporate oversight to calm the volatile situation. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, designed to make me look isolated and to fracture the unified front of my company. They expected me to scramble. They expected me to issue panicked, defensive press releases or to furiously deny the rumors, thereby granting them legitimacy. Instead, Evelyn Sloan executed a flawlessly disciplined counter-strategy. We did not react publicly. We preempted them entirely, before the bank's automated risk management software could even flag Vanessa's court filing. Evelyn and I walked directly into the massive glass and steel headquarters of our primary lender. We sat down with the senior vice president of commercial lending and handed him a pristine, heavily authenticated binder. It contained our flawless quarterly audit, our fully funded payroll history, and the preemptive sworn declarations from our largest clients attesting to our absolute operational stability. We did not wait for the bank to ask questions. We answered them before the questions could even be fully formulated. We controlled the narrative by simply proving that the panic was artificially manufactured. Evelyn applied the exact same ruthless efficiency to the nervous hospital clients. She dispatched secure, legally verified compliance records directly to their procurement officers, completely bypassing the rumor mill. She neutralized the whisper campaign by suffocating it with cold, hard, undisputed data. While Evelyn stabilized the external perimeter, our hired digital forensics expert systematically dismantled the core of Vanessa's legal petition. We spent Thursday morning in a dark, climate-controlled server room, watching a brilliant technician tear apart the supposed internal emails my sister planned to introduce to the judge. The expert projected the code onto a large monitor, pointing to the underlying architecture of the digital files. He identified massive, undeniable manipulation. There were blatantly mismatched server timestamps showing that emails supposedly sent at 2 o'clock in the morning had actually originated from a time zone 3 hours away. He highlighted glaring forwarding anomalies that proved distinct conversations had been forcibly spliced together. Most damning of all, he isolated the digital signatures attached to the most erratic, hostile messages, proving definitively that they had been lifted entirely from older, archived messages and pasted onto newly fabricated text. "These are not organic communications," the expert stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "This is digital taxidermy. They killed your old correspondence, stuffed it with new words, and posed it to look alive." The rest of our legal arsenal locked into place with terrifying speed. Marlene officially agreed to testify in open court, her tape recorder secured in an evidence locker. The independent estate office delivered the certified original copy of my mother's amended trust. Finally, the private courier company, threatened with a massive federal lawsuit by Evelyn, produced their intake logs. The logs conclusively confirmed that the red velvet Christmas parcel had been deliberately opened, repackaged, and resealed at a third-party law office service center directly linked to the boutique firm representing Vanessa and North Barrow Holdings. Despite the overwhelming strength of our defense, I barely slept. I existed on a brutal diet of black coffee and sheer adrenaline. This period of my life was not defined by a dramatic psychological collapse, but by the agonizing, suffocating cost of maintaining absolute composure. The people attacking me knew my history intimately. They knew my business calendar down to the exact hour. They knew my deepest emotional pressure points because they shared my bloodline. Every time I had to sit in a room and listen to Evelyn coldly dissect my sister's attempt to destroy me, a small, heavy piece of my soul fractured. Fighting a stranger is a matter of strategy. Fighting your own family is a matter of profound, exhausting endurance. On the night before the emergency hearing, the warehouse was entirely quiet. I walked out of my office, past the darkened dispatch desks, and pushed open the heavy steel doors leading to the exterior gravel yard. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of deep winter chill that settles directly into your bones. The massive white refrigerated trailers were parked in perfect, orderly rows, their heavy diesel compressors humming with a steady, reassuring rhythm. I stood entirely alone in the darkness, the vapor of my breath drifting up toward the harsh glare of the security floodlights. I placed my bare hand against the freezing metal side of truck number 7. I remembered the exact day we bought it. I remembered the agonizing negotiation, the sheer terror of signing the financing agreement, and the quiet, desperate hope Noah and I shared when it finally rolled into the yard. I had traded the softest years of my life to keep these engines running. I had bled, I had starved, and I had fought a war of attrition against debt and failure so that this company could survive the grave my father dug for it. I looked out over the fleet, and something fundamental shifted inside my chest. The lingering guilt, the deeply ingrained instinct to protect the ghost of my family, finally burned away entirely. It was replaced by an armor made of cold, impenetrable steel. Tomorrow, when I walked into that courtroom, my goal would no longer be merely defensive. I was not just going to prove that Harbor Vale Coldlink was stable. I was not just going to deflect the blow. I stood in the dark dispatch yard and made one final, absolute internal choice. Tomorrow was going to be an execution. Tomorrow was about stripping away every lie, exposing every shadow, and permanently ending Vanessa's access to my life, my legacy, and my company for good. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung shut, sealing us inside chamber number 4. It was exactly 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. The air in the room was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Vanessa sat at the petitioner's table, wearing a dark navy suit that looked completely unnatural on her. Her legal team, funded by the invisible hand of North Barrow Holdings, moved with practiced, aggressive urgency. Their lead attorney, a man with a sharp jaw and a tailored gray suit, stood before the judge. He did not waste a single second. He painted a terrifying, urgent picture of a critical medical infrastructure teetering on the absolute edge of collapse. He claimed, with a voice full of manufactured gravity, that I was profoundly unstable. He argued that the crushing pressure of the past 5 years had fundamentally compromised my psychological fitness. "Your Honor," the attorney stated, pacing in front of the bench, "we are not here to steal a family legacy. We are here to prevent catastrophic mismanagement. Harbor Vale Coldlink transports highly volatile, life-saving materials. The respondent is actively exhibiting signs of severe burnout, erratic decision-making, and financial paranoia." He entered the altered digital files into evidence. He displayed the spliced emails on the courtroom monitor, highlighting the manufactured hostility and the fabricated financial confusion. He framed the requested temporary transfer of control not as a hostile corporate takeover, but as an act of prudent, necessary stewardship. He was banking entirely on the judge preferring the safety of extreme caution over the complex nuance of family dynamics. He wanted the judge to look at the smoke and assume there was a raging fire. I sat next to Evelyn Sloan, my hands resting flat on the polished mahogany table. I did not shake. I did not look at my sister. I waited for the petitioner to finish building their house of cards. When Evelyn finally stood up, she did not match their frantic, urgent energy. She moved with the slow, terrifying deliberation of a predator that had already locked the gates. "Prudent stewardship," Evelyn repeated, letting the words hang in the silent courtroom. She turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner is shouting fire in a crowded theater to justify stealing the cash register in the ensuing panic. Harbor Vale Coldlink is not distressed at all, unless this court allows Vanessa Holloway to actively make it look that way." Evelyn did not offer emotional pleas. She delivered an avalanche of indisputable, authenticated facts. She submitted our pristine third-party financial audits covering the last 36 months. She entered the sworn, notarized declarations from the chief procurement officers of our 3 largest hospital networks, all attesting to flawless delivery records and absolute operational transparency. She presented our lending compliance certificates and an untouched, fully funded payroll history spanning hundreds of consecutive weeks. She proved, mathematically and objectively, that the company was a fortress of stability. Then, Evelyn called our digital forensics expert to the stand. The testimony was a surgical dismantling of the petitioner's entire narrative. The expert walked the judge through the underlying code of the supposed internal emails. He demonstrated, step by step, how the timestamps were mismatched, how the routing metadata was corrupted, and how my digital signatures had been violently severed from old, mundane archived messages and stitched onto newly fabricated text. He proved that the key exhibits were not generated in the ordinary flow of business. They were malicious, engineered forgeries. I watched the color completely drain from the face of Vanessa's lead attorney. He looked down at his legal pad, realizing the private equity firm had handed him a live grenade disguised as evidence. But Evelyn was not finished. Defending the fortress was not enough. She was there to level the enemy's camp. "The petitioner claims she is acting out of familial concern," Evelyn said, walking back to our table and picking up a thick-bound folder. "Let us examine the true nature of that concern." She delivered the deeper fatal blows in rapid succession. First, she introduced the certified, original copy of my late mother's amended trust, reading the sole control clause into the official record. She established the legal framework that stripped Vanessa of all governance rights the moment she abandoned the company during a crisis. To prove that abandonment was an intentional, hostile act, Evelyn played the audio recording salvaged by Marlene. Vanessa's own voice echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom, viciously declaring she wanted absolutely nothing to do with the debt, the trucks, or the company. It destroyed the lie of grief-driven confusion in a matter of seconds. Finally, Evelyn introduced the high-definition video and audio recording from my warehouse office. The courtroom watched as my sister, dressed in her designer cashmere coat, arrogantly admitted she knew the bank would panic. They listened as she actively threatened to leverage a frozen payroll and a disrupted hospital supply chain just to force an inevitable, distressed sale. The silence in the chamber following the video playback was absolute and suffocating. The judge, a seasoned magistrate who had likely seen decades of corporate warfare, looked down at Vanessa with an expression of profound, unmasked disgust. The pattern was perfectly, undeniably clear. This was never a worried sister petition. It was a highly coordinated, criminal attempt to manufacture artificial governance chaos for pure predatory financial gain. The ruling was swift and entirely uncompromising. The judge denied the emergency relief in full. He condemned the proxy scheme and the coercive ambush on the official record, and then he delivered the final, crushing blow. He formally referred the falsified digital evidence, the corporate espionage, and the extortionary conduct for immediate criminal review by the district attorney, alongside recommending severe civil sanctions against Vanessa, her husband, and the external parties who had facilitated the fraud. The gavel struck the block. The war was officially over. As the courtroom cleared, Vanessa remained seated at her table. She looked completely stunned, her carefully maintained facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She was utterly exposed, facing public bankruptcy, civil ruin, and potential criminal indictments. I stood up and buttoned my blazer. I did not walk over to her table. I did not chase an apology she was incapable of giving, nor did I deliver a triumphant, gloating speech. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on her and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving her entirely alone in the mess she had created. Noah was waiting for me on the courthouse steps. The gray slush of the morning had melted, giving way to a bright, clear afternoon sky. He took my hand, his grip warm and solid, and we walked down to the street. We did not take the day off to celebrate. We drove straight back to the industrial park. I walked into my office, sat down at my scarred wooden desk, and opened the massive, multi-hospital renewal contract that had been paused during the chaos. I picked up my pen and signed my name on the bottom line, securing our absolute independence for another 5 years. Looking out the window at the heavy diesel trucks pulling out of the gravel yard, heading out to deliver life-saving supplies across the region, I finally understood the truth. The real revenge was never about orchestrating my sister's destruction. Her greed had accomplished that all on its own. The truest, most absolute revenge was simply surviving the fire she refused to help me fight, and building a magnificent, unbreakable life that she could never, ever take back. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to hear where you are listening from. So please leave a comment down below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.